Hello everyone, and welcome to this introduction to the newly improved Spline Warp and Grid Warp nodes inside of Nuke 6.3. These nodes have been overhauled in a major way, leading to an increase in speed, stability and user interaction when warping and morphing. In this video we'll be covering new features of these nodes and demonstrating some of their uses. So we're going to dive straight in with the Grid Warp, which can be found in its usual home in the Transform tab under Grid Warp. And you can see when looking at it straight away that you have your usual source, destination and background inputs. I'm just going to plug the source in here. At first glance you can see that we have our usual properties bin with some overhauled icons here for copying and pasting our keys. We also have some extra options and our extra render tab, which we will be looking at in a moment. We also have a new tool bin here for tools for adjusting the resolution of our grid. And along the top here we have quick access to a lot of our parameters. So straight away, once it's plugged in, you can see it's automatically snapped to the resolution of our grid. We're looking at some footage here that's kindly been donated to us from FXPHD. Now let's just start from the top and work across. So we have our output drop down here, which basically gives us the choice of showing the output of just our source grid. So right now this is just our source footage here. Then we can view our source footage warped. If we have an image plugged into our destination, then we have the ability to see the destination image, and then we have the ability to then see that warped. And then if we turn on morph here, we get access to the mix and warp values here for when you're doing morphing. I'm just going to put this back to source warped to start with. Now the next feature you'll see across here is we have the first three boxes here, which are relating directly to the visible grid. So these are toggles for whether or not we are looking at our source grid or our destination grid. So if I just turn off this A here, you can see that I have the choice of my destination grid. So now right now I'm viewing my source. If I turn that off, I'm seeing nothing. That's my destination grid. If I turn on the A, what this is going to do is this is going to make the best choice based on the output that I am choosing. So if I look at the source grid here, you can see that I'm viewing my source grid there. If I choose to see source warped, I'm actually going to see the result of the destination. If I see destination, that's going to show me the destination grid, and destination warped is going to show me the source grid. So you can see how that works, and most of the time you'll find using this automatic toggle here the best way to go. We also have an auto key button here, which allows us to auto key any changes we make to the grid. And then here we have the ability to then ripple edit those points based on whether or not we ripple across all of our frames from the start of our sequence or to the end, or a user-defined range. If you put it into ripple mode, you'll see, much like on the rotor paint node, we get a red outline just to make sure we know we're in ripple edit. And any changes we make to any of our points whilst we're in ripple mode are going to be carried across every single frame. So if we have multiple keyframes, for example, on any individual point, any changes we make in ripple mode will be added to all of the keyframes evenly. Now, the next thing we have is the ability to see the labels of our points. We have a toggle here for our transform handle. And then next to that, we've got one of the biggest changes in both the Grid Warp and the Spline Warp nodes, and that is this persistent preview here. So if you remember before, what would happen is every time you adjusted your Grid Warp, what would happen is you would first see a low-res proxy version of the warp you were doing. Then once you released, then it would snap back and you'd have to wait for that scan line to finish. Now what happens is as we move our point, we actually go into an OpenGL view of our warp, which is really nicely detailed and works really smoothly and is very interactive. Then when we let go of this, we have a very minute pause, depending on the intensity of the warp, before we snap back to our render. So it's holding that OpenGL preview until the scan line has finished. So that really does mean that this becomes a much more interactive tool. Now next up, I'm just going to bring in a new Grid Warp node here just to show you this, is the division slider. So this is a nice quick way of increasing the divisions of your grid. You can see it's totally interactive and nice and fast. If you have made adjustments to your grid, so I'm just going to quickly move some points around here in a kind of arbitrary fashion, making a very horrible image. And now I attempt to adjust the divisions here. Nuke's going to give me a warning and saying that if I subdivide this grid, any manually moved points may not match in the new grid, but it's going to do its best to rebuild the topology using our new divisions to get the best result. So if I hit yes here, you can see that I now have a much denser grid and pretty much the same result as we had before with our lower divisions. So it does a really good job of realigning the topology. Now, over here on this side, you can see that we have a whole set of new tools here. So if you remember before, every time you wanted to add resolution to your grid using the add resolution button, you would have to click on it, add some resolution, then click to select again, add more resolution. Now we can just hit this plus key here, and we can just interactively add resolution on either axis. We also have the ability to then remove in the same fashion. We then have, just skipping this one for a moment, we then have, if we select points, we then can subdivide in either one axis or the other axis, or if we select again, we can subdivide in both axes. So that's a nice quick way, once again, of interactively increasing the resolution of our grid. Now, one of the other really useful features here is the ability to draw a new boundary for your grid warp. So rather than having to scale it around, we can just select this and say I want to just grid warp this lady's face here, which is what we're going to be doing in our next example anyway. I can now just drag a grid over it, let go, and that is going to give me a new mesh. And I'm just going to have this make a resolution of 3, so it's nice and easy to view. Now if I want to just change my mind about where that grid is, I can just draw again, and it's going to replace it. Then I can just draw again to replace it there. You can't have more than one grid at any one time, but it does automatically rebuild it somewhere else for you. So that is also a very, very quick way of having an interactive method of laying down a grid. Now, just moving over into our properties here, we still have our keys section here, only it's much neater. We have the ability to copy and paste our keys from our source grid to our destination grid. We can still resize our source and destination grids here to the size of our image. We have access to the output again, as we have here, and we also have our warp and mix tabs here. We can also now add masks in. We have our transform parameters as well on top of, so that's another global transformation here. And we have that for source and destination, and the ability to source our destination's transformation from the source grid. In our render tab, we can change the submesh resolutions. This is the accuracy and detail of the mesh in between our different points. So the higher this goes, the smoother you may find your warp to be, but it may also slow down the processing of it. And then we also have the ability to change our filtering if we require a bit of sharpening or smoothing when we do our warp. So that is the main properties of it. So now let's look at an example of using it. So let's say we want to use the grid warper to augment our lady's face here, maybe making her lip look slightly more swollen, or maybe her cheek or her eyebrow. So what I've done is I've done a very quick rudimentary track of her eyes, and now I'm going to bring in our grid warp node like so. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use the interactive grid drawing tool here to draw a grid around her face. And I'm going to go to my first frame, and I'm just going to clear my tracker's parameters for the minute, select this grid and move it down. Now I'm going to change over to the source view here so I don't actually see any of the warp that's happening. So I'm going to move this into a good place, and then the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the topology of this grid to fit her face nicely. So I'm just going to start moving points around to get them into a position that I think is useful for us. So just going to isolate the edges of our mouth here, just pull these down a little here. Then I'm going to start interactively adding in some extra lines, so maybe one here, one for the boundary of that, especially if I'm going to adjust our eyebrow. I'm going to do a very quick rough representation of how one might do this. So very much like a model of a face mesh in 3D, I'm just laying out her features here. So I want one for the bottom of her mouth, one for the top of her mouth. I just want to curve these round a little here. So I'm just now going to add a line all the way down the middle here for her nose, the middle of her lip. I'm going to add one across the center here for the tip of her nose. And I'm going to say that that is probably, maybe with the exception of one extra one down here, a good number of grids. There you go, just be greedy, one more. So now I've got this grid for her face. What I can do is go into Transform tab, and using the fairly new link to parameter, I can just go in here and say I want to link to tracker 1's translate. Now if we look at this, I now have a grid that is tracked to her face. globally, like so. So now if I wanted to, I could go in here and just make some, with auto key on, I could just make a few adjustments. So maybe here her mouth opens, so I'm going to want to sort of have that represented like so. Maybe pull this down. And just keep just sort of noodling this until I get a result that I kind of am happy with. I'm just going to leave it like that for now. So now what I want to do is I want to have a look at this source warped. So if I look at this, obviously it's going to horrifically warp her face. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to copy my source grid and paste it as my destination grid. So now you can see that my source warped grid, where I'm viewing the destination here, now matches, which means that between my source and my source warped, I don't have any deformation. So now this is where the fun stuff starts. So I've got my grid tracked to her face. I've got a nicely laid out topology. I can go in here now, and I'd probably do this with the ripple edit turned on. So I'm going to put this onto all frames. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to start by just maybe spreading out her lip a bit here and here. Trying to make that look as uncomfortable as possible. Maybe just spread out over here a little. I'm actually just going to add another point in here interactively. You can see how easy that is to do, because I might just want to spread this area out a bit, make it look a bit more painful. Maybe I just want to lift her eyebrow up without adjusting her eye. Maybe make this look a little more swollen, like so. So now I've made some quite subtle adjustments, maybe a little less subtle than I probably would do in reality, but just so you guys can see. You can see, so this is before and this is after. All using that persistent preview, so I got a really nice feedback. And then when I play through here, you can also see that the grid warp is now quite a lot quicker. So that's just caching through like so. And you can see now that we have a more injured girl. We also have in here a mask input. So if I bring in a roto node like so and draw that out, maybe let's just cut right across the face, something quite brutal, and plug that in as a mask. You can see now that only inside that mask are we getting our warp. So if I move this over, you can see that I'm masking out that warp. This works nicely with a feathered mask as well if you really want to blend in your warps. Another big improvement with both the grid warp and the spline warp, in fact, is the ability to attach trackers to any of the grid points or spline points you wish, and still have a record or way of checking to see which of these points is attached to what. So I am just going to bring in a grid warp quickly, like so. I'm just going to chuck this on source for now just to show my point, and I've got a tracker here that is tracked to the corner of her eye. I'm just going to select my grid warp, select my point, and go link to tracker 1, track 1. You can see instantly I now have a grid warp point that is tracked to her eye. And then if I right click on this and go back to link to and go to tracker dialog, I can see what I'm currently connected to. So tracker1.translate. So I have a way of knowing and also changing what that is connected to. So that was a big deal, I think, and that is another massive step forward with the grid warper. And that's pretty much all of the grid warp features. So now we can move on to the spline warp. Now, the spline warp in 6.3 is quite a different beast to what we've been used to. So I'm just going to pull one of these in from the transform tab under spline warp. There we go. Now, as you can see straight away, the properties bin has been expanded to have a layers stack here. We've got a tool bin here, and we've got a lot of our properties at the top of our viewer accessible nice and easily. So I'm just going to quickly run through some of these properties. Many of them are similar to the grid warp, and then we'll get into showing what some of the tools use. So we've got the same sort of tools in the grid warp as auto key, point labels, transform handled toggles, ripple edit, the same output drop down here for source warped and source, etc., etc. We've got a very similar manifestation of our 3 toggles here between auto toggling the curve that we want to see based on our output here, or manually toggling which ones we want to see. We also have our persistent preview. So once again, that OpenGL persistent preview that we've just saw in the grid warp that really enhances user interaction. We will then also have the ability to toggle on and off shapes contributions, as well as lock them down as well. So let's just start off straight away by getting in here and drawing a shape, so we can start seeing what we've got. we've got our usual roto candidates in here. I'm just going to start with a Bezier, and I'm just going to draw that like so. And at this point you can see that we don't have any change between our source and our source warped. Now if I go to source warped and I just zoom in straight away, I'm just going to select a point, maybe here, and I'm going to stretch this out. Now you can see not only are we getting a warp, but we're also getting this new UI feature that we haven't seen before, which is this dotted line. Now these dotted lines show you the connection between your destination grid, which we're currently adjusting here, and the source grid that it comes from. Now this means that if I turn off the automatic toggle here, you can see that I can see the source grid, but often having those two grids becomes quite confusing on screen. So we can turn off our source grid and just have our destination grid, but still have some kind of idea as to how far we've moved our points. So we can obviously adjust our points freeform like this, or you can also click on this dotted line and then basically just slide left and right to slide the point along that connecting line. So you're basically returning it back to its original position. So that's a really nice, useful way of being able to adjust your warp once you've found a good position for it. Then on top of that, we also have another way of understanding the connection between our two splines. So I'm just going to turn on the other spline here, but first I'm actually just going to warp all of this stuff up so that we've got some difference, like so. And I'm going to turn on our source grid now. Now there's a toggle here which is called correspondence visibility. If I turn that on, you can see that we get these lines that are connected between our source and our destination grid. So we have them at the beginning and then equally spread out at 2 points along them. These are our correspondence lines. Now on our toolbar here we also have a correspondence tab where we can add, modify or remove correspondence points. So let's start by adding a few. So I'm just going to add a few extra correspondence points between. And what these correspondence points are, if I just hop over to modify, is it's basically saying that at this point on my source curve I want to be corresponding to this point on my destination curve. And all of these are fully keyframeable, fully editable correspondence points. So you've got two levels of adjustment there. You've got the actual spline points that you've created, and then you've also got these correspondence points between them to also help you manipulate and adjust the minutiae of your warp. So they're really, really nice features. The next key feature in the spline warp is the fact that we can have multiple spline warps all within one node. So we have our layer stack over here. So I'm just going to go over into my Bezier drawing mode again. So I could here select to have a spline warp for her mouth. I could then do an ellipse for the nose area here. And as you can see, I've got 3 warps all happening within the same layer stack. I can then use the visibility to turn on and off the contribution of them, like so, as you can see. So I've got these 3 warps all happening now, all within the same layer stack. We just remove these. Now another really useful feature is using this layer stack to have multiple masks adjusting the contribution of your warps. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw an ellipse around the eye here, like so. And we're going to draw it intersecting with the original spline warp here. And what I'm going to do is, instead of having this ellipse set to standard, I'm going to go over here and there's these 2 toggle buttons here. One is a hard boundary and one is a soft boundary. If I turn on the hard boundary like so, you can see that the warp is very, very rigidly only happening within that area. So if I adjust this, you can see I'm getting a very hard boundary to my warp. If I change that over to a softer boundary, you can see that it's adjusting the contribution, but it's not totally fixed to within that line, which gives you a softer fall off. Then you can also have multiple masks like this. So I could draw another one for this eye, which I could set to be a hard mask, for example. And all of these are just adjusting the contribution of these warps. So that is another really useful feature. It's that ability to have multiple layers of warp within one spline warp node with multiple layers of masking within that as well. So I've just reset again here so I can show you another tool in the spline warp. So I'm going to bring in a new spline warp node. Now this new tool is the pin tool, and it's really, really funky and incredibly useful and can be used a number of different ways. So I'm just going to first of all draw a spline down the center of her face here. And then I'm just going to make a warp adjustment to it, like so. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select over here the pin tool, and I'm going to start dropping down pins, and I'm going to drop one here in the middle of her eye, and I'm going to drop one on the other side of her face here. And what you can see is where I'm dropping these pins is actually creating a region around that pin that is limiting the effect of the warp from this spline. So if I put another pin down here by her mouth, another pin here, you can see that now that warp's only really happening in that center area. I'm just going to give you a little demo here. So if I move this around, you can see that there's a definite limiting region here and here. You can see that you still have a bit of a warp change further out. So if you want to pin that down, you can just drop a couple of extra pins, and then we can even try dropping some really close here and here. So we really start limiting that warp down the center of her face there. So that's one way of using the pins. It's a really nice way once you've laid down a warp spline for you just to go in and then just make really tiny adjustments to kind of limit areas that you don't want to be warped. Now, the second use for it is actually as its own warping tool. So I am just going to delete that and bring in another spline warp. So this time what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drop some pins around. I'm going to put some here, here and here. And then I'm going to put some around the outside of her hair, like so. It's a nice interactive quick tool. And now you can view this as basically like you've laid out a grid warp, but without any connecting lines and without it needing to be any particular shape. And you now have, if I just move this around, you now see that you have a point that is much like a grid warp, warping, but it's also limited by the surrounding points. You still get your offset line here, so you can see where you've come from, so your source to and from using the dotted line. So now I've got these, I can select all of these outer points and do something really horrific here. So I can just scale up the outer part of her face here. And then if I wanted to limit the effect on our guy, I could then drop some extra pins around so that we were really just limiting that small area. So that's a pretty strange effect. We can undo that, and obviously with the way we've laid this out, we can also then select the inner portion and just kind of scale in the center of her face just to really make things look weird. So you can see there you've got two ways of using this pin tool. You can either use it as a limiting feature, so it's basically going to limit the area of your warps, or you can use it as its kind of own point-based grid warp, which is really fast, really interactive, and with the persistent preview does give you a really, really fast feedback. So hopefully you can see that you've got a fully featured tool set here. The warpers have taken a giant leap forward, and they've improved in terms of their stability, their speed, and their interactivity. So hopefully you guys can sit down and have a play with these now 6.3 is out, and reap the benefits. Thanks for watching.